The first intent, support life. I refrain from opposing or harming anyone. I allow others to have their own experiences. I see life in all things and honor it as if it were my own. I support life. Okay, there was a wondrous group of people who walked along the shores of the Dead Sea between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, who called themselves the Essenes. And the Essenes were the ones who were responsible for bringing the Christ energy onto the planet at that time. And the Essenes had a code of ethics. First principle in the Essenes' code of ethics was self-preservation, staying alive. Because if we do not stay alive, we're not here to evolve. We're not here to do what we came here to do on this wondrous earth, and much less to enjoy all of the Earth Mother's abundance and all the experiences that we enjoy in our lives. Staying alive, it's number one. And how that one got lost in the shuffle, I do not know. Boggles the mind. Staying alive. Supporting the life of every living being upon this planet. And that is the paradigm we are working toward. And that is why we meet here today, to do what we do, to help each other support life on this earth, so that life not only thrives and survives, we live in complete comfort and joy. That is the ideal, and we can have that. Now, this all came to me back in the mid-70s in Kona, and I must tell you that for the first 4 years of living on the farm in Kona, paradise. Heaven on earth. Every day just get up and do what we want to do. We were working with the laws of manifestation. Everything was coming like a charm, like it still is. And one day, a new neighbor moved in. And for the purposes of this story, the new neighbor's name is Dead Doug. And Dead Doug was a Detroit street punk who liked nothing better to walk up and down this famous road in the mountains of Kona called Rabbit Hill Road, where about 25 families lived on. And he always had a stick, a rock, a machete, a shovel, a weapon, something in his hands. Little bitty skinny guy who liked nothing better to threaten whoever it was that he ran across, that if we didn't do whatever it was that he wanted us to do, he was going to go get the Bradas from down South Point, the Hawaiian thugs, to beat up on us. And we all went from living in paradise every day to living in fear. All of us. Except, of course, for BJ. BJ could have cared less about this little snake. So, sure enough, one day, BJ and I are having our morning coffee there, and we hear this ruckus down on the road, and it's Dead Doug yelling up at us through the trees. There were a border of about 60 feet of trees, guavas and dense bananas and so forth. Between us and the road, nobody could see what was where we lived up there. Dead Doug's yelling up at us that if we do not get down on the road and fill in a bump on the road right now, he was going to burn our houses down. Well, I had the good sense to wait until I heard his car go down the road. And I went and took a shovel, and it took about, 4, 5, 6 scoops of small lava rocks and so forth to fill in this little bump in the road, you know. And I took a scratch rake to rake it out perfectly smooth. So he didn't have me to squawk at anymore. And while I'm raking it out with the scratch rake, down the trail comes BJ out of the jungle there, and he motions to a spot over in the shade of my old Dodge Power Wagon. And we sit down there on a couple of upside-down white 5-gallon buckets. And he says this to me. He says, Tony, he said, you know, he said, whoever or whatever you put your attention on, that's who you're becoming. or that's what you're becoming. He said you can put your attention on the saints, you can put your attention on Gandhi or Mother Teresa, and you'll become like them, or you can put your attention on Dead Doug, and you'll become like him. You put your attention on the tyrant, and he said if you put your attention on Dead Doug, he said, you'll notice that if you begin to monitor your thoughts real closely and watch what's going on in your head real closely, he said, you'll see that your thoughts begin to turn dark. And you'll see yourself in your mind's eye, as long as you're holding your attention on the tyrant, you'll see yourself in your mind's eye going to get the brothers from down South Point on Dead Doug. Or you'll see yourself, again, if you hold your attention on Dead Doug, you'll see yourself in your imagination sneaking through the rainforest with a can of gas in your hands going to light fire to Dead Doug's house. He said he thought I had much better things to do with my attention than to keep it on the tyrant. Like keeping my attention on how to make the fruit trees grow better, or how to be happier. Anything other than holding it on the tyrant. He said, besides that, he said, the universe has ways of taking care of tyrants that do not involve my meddling or participation. It was interesting because it wasn't but a couple of months later that Dead Doug missed one of the sharp curves on the narrow road that snakes its way down to the southern point of the Big Island and killed himself. And those of us on Rabbit Hill Road, we were not as evolved back then as we are now, so we threw a party. We did. And celebrated and went back to living life the way it was before the tyrant moved in. Ah. Interesting. One of my favorite American authors, Richard Bach, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, we were just talking about him, and his book, Illusions, the Reluctant Messiah book, has a fabulous quote in it, and it goes like this: we become like the worst in those we oppose. We become like who it is we oppose. And it doesn't matter if it's a crazy neighbor like Dead Doug, if it's a so-called terrorist from across the sea, if it's a drugged-out street criminal, or it's one of our own leaders who we happen to disagree with. It doesn't matter. If we oppose them in any way, we begin to become just like them. So my question for you is that once you realize that you're becoming like whoever it is you oppose, shouldn't that be reason enough to stop the opposition? I'd like to tell you another story, if I might, that's one of my favorites, actually, and it has to do, this story has to do with a great warrior general in a time on this earth some 70,000 years ago, in a land almost forgotten that existed out in what is now called the Pacific Ocean, and this land was called Lemuria. It was the civilization that preceded a much better known civilization that was sunk under the waves that's called Atlantis. And in Lemuria we had periods of time where we were extremely empowered, and that we were in telepathic communication with the dolphins, and the dolphins used to teach us. In fact, many of these teachings came from the dolphins, these teachings of empowerment. And toward the end of the Lemurian culture, when it was going through its death throes and its end times, very similar to what's going on planet Earth nowadays. Why? They were going through wars as well. And there was a war raging in a valley, 10,000 soldiers fighting, and the leader of the Lemurian army, a great warrior general, his name was Li Qing. And the valley floor was strewn with blood and bodies of fallen soldiers. And they had fought all day long in this valley, and the sun was beginning to set over the hillside, and Li Qing himself found himself in a sword-to-sword combat with a younger, stronger foe, a young man who was fighting with him for some 20-25 minutes to the limits of their endurance. And in the course of the fighting, the young man tripped over a fallen body, and as he tripped, he fell backwards onto his back, and his helmet flew off, and his sword flew from his hand, and he's laying on his back, and Li Qing stood over him, ready to run him through, but he took just a second to look him in the face, and he saw that this is just a boy of 19 or 20 years old who hadn't had the opportunity to even taste the fruits of life yet. And it stopped him for just a second longer to look into the young man's eyes. And in that instant, in looking into the young man's eyes, he saw a part of himself. And he knew that if he were to harm this young man, he would only be harming himself. Whereupon he set his sword aside and walked over to a little hillside where 10,000 soldiers that day watched as he bowed his head and asked God for forgiveness for what he had done. And a light began to come on. And he began to glow. And he began to actually ascend as he glowed, and hovered over to a place over this battlefield and settled down in front of the young man and embraced him, the man he had been fighting with earlier, hugged him, and bid him to go back to his family and fiancée and live out the rest of his years in peace. Whereupon all 10,000 soldiers that day threw their swords aside and went back to their respective lands and homes and families to tell the story of the great warrior general who dispensed that which is termed mercy. Mercy. It's the one ingredient we've forgotten about nowadays. Mercy, it would solve all of our ills. Mercy is a true path unto peace, unto the peace we seek, if we would just dispense, just give mercy unto our fellow travelers. For indeed, who among us would deny it unto themselves? None. None. When faced with the point of the sword, each and every one of us would appreciate mercy. And yet we're so quick to deny it to our fellow men. I suggest unto you that the message that Li Qing left unto us that time, the message of mercy, needs to be re-examined and brought forth into this culture, into this time in history, and everything will get better. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and give you a little bit of history of the Intenders. When we first started the Intenders, there were the four of us, me and my girlfriend at the time, Betsy, and our good friends, Mark and Tina. And just four good friends wanting to help each other, and we were sitting around a circle and putting intentions and gratitudes in our circle, and lo and behold, they were manifesting like crazy for us. And we had been doing this a very short time when Mark happened to mention that Tina has a gift, that back in the mid-'80s, early and mid-'80s, that she had been part of a group in the North San Diego County area, Encinitas and Del Mar area, San Diego, as part of a group called Love in Action. And that people were coming every week to hear her be a messenger or a channel for an entity, a being, named Li Qing. And so I said, well, you know, the most interesting thing I've been doing, this was after I had left BJ and was living in Hilo side and had been living there a couple of years. And I said, most interesting thing I've been doing for the last couple of years is watching the guava trees grow. I said, you know, let's get Lee Ching out of the box. I want to talk to him. You know, and she did. Tina said her prayer, the same prayer again we started with tonight. Only those who stand for the highest good can answer the call to that. And it's in every book I ever wrote, that particular intention, beginning prayer. And what happened next, I never would have imagined in a million years. Tina closed her eyes, and out came the most loving, caring being I have ever met in my entire life. And over a period of the next couple of years, we began to tape these sessions. I asked Lee Ching every question I could possibly think of. What's going on? Everything. Didn't I? Yeah. And, you know, what's going on with the economy, and what's going on with the government, and what's going on with my gardens, and what's going on with the volcano. We could see this glow in the sky at night from Kilauea. And what's going on with my love life. And what's going on with all this stuff. And looking back in hindsight, he answered all these questions not only accurately, but with such love that we never wanted these sessions together to end. And he told us, he said, these groups are going to grow. We said, no way. He said these famous words. He said, you'll see. So we had, unbeknownst to us at the time, a channel of the same caliber as Abraham Hicks, Cryon, exactly the same caliber. We were so blessed. And, you know, and I would ask Lee Ching these questions. One night I remember saying, you know, I feel like something's missing from our circle. He said, why don't you put some gratitudes in the circle too? There's a biggie, because gratitude's the key to everything. And I remember saying one night, I'm interested in the properties of sound and how it affects the group dynamic. He said, why don't you tone for a little while after you say your intentions and gratitudes? From the first time that we toned together, it was as if our souls fused together. A oneness was created. And by the time we finish with today, we will go through that same exercise, and you will all experience a oneness, just like we did back then, because we've refined that process, and we've got it down to a little 6-step process we go through, and we guarantee it. Every time we do it, it throws us into oneness. Thanks to Lee Ching. So, fortunately, Tina is here on the main line with us today, and I would like to tell you that I'm extremely honored and blessed and proud to introduce you to Tina Stober and Lee Ching.